Late autumn, 1944. Somewhere along the fractured Western Front, a thin veil of morning fog rolled over an abandoned French farmyard, its walls cracked, its fields torn by tank treads long since gone silent. German boots crunched over frozen mud as Colonel Ernst Keller led a small inspection party toward a cluster of sheds half hidden behind shattered timber. The air carried the metallic scent of spent shells and the distant thud of American artillery, slow and rhythmic, like a clock marking down the final hours of a war slipping from Germany's grasp. Keller paused at the doorway. Inside, rows of dark silhouettes stood in utter stillness, barrels, stacked in tight formation, sealed and untouched. A lone U.S. tanker truck sat in the corner, its hoses coiled neatly, almost mockingly. When Keller stepped closer and pried open the nearest drum, the sharp, unmistakable smell of gasoline filled the room. Not a few barrels, not a scattered cache, but tens of thousands of gallons of American fuel, enough to move an armored division farther than his own army had managed in weeks. And as that realization sank in, Keller understood something colder than the winter air. Germany was running on fumes, while the enemy had oceans of firepower waiting just behind the horizon. The enormity of that disparity would only become clearer when placed in its full wartime context. By the final months of 1944, Germany's war machine was no longer held together by steel, discipline, or ideology. It was held together by whatever drops of fuel could still be siphoned from shattered depots, abandoned trucks, or villages unlucky enough to lie between retreating Wehrmacht units and the advancing Allies. The Third Reich had begun the war with confidence in its mechanized blitzkrieg. But now, 5 years later, those same engines that once thundered across Europe were silent, rusting, or cannibalized for parts. Without fuel, even the most elite formations became little more than infantry with ornate patches. The roots of this crisis stretched back years. As early as mid-1943, Allied bombers had begun pounding Germany's synthetic fuel plants, Luna, Politz, Bolin, and others, cutting into a production system that had always been fragile. The Reich had no vast domestic oil fields. Instead, it relied heavily on synthetic production from coal and one single vital lifeline, the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. When the Allies struck Ploiești in 1943 and then seized Romania itself in 1944, that lifeline snapped. Overnight, Germany lost over half of its natural oil supply. By the autumn of 1944, the impact was catastrophic. Panzer divisions that once roared across open plains now struggled to fuel even a handful of tanks. Operational orders increasingly referenced fuel shortages more than enemy movements. Commanders were instructed to avoid unnecessary maneuvers, conserve every drop, and abandon vehicles when gasoline ran out. It was not uncommon for entire battalions of tanks to be left behind simply because they had no fuel to relocate. The Luftwaffe suffered just as severely. Aircraft sat idle on runways, their pilots watching Allied bombers cross the skies with impunity. Some airfields became graveyards of potential, filled with machines that could fly but could not be fueled. The paralysis spread downward into every branch of the army: motorized infantry, supply convoys, reconnaissance units. Logistics collapsed not from enemy encirclement, but from environmental starvation. Germany had effectively run out of mobility. Meanwhile, the United States operated on a different scale entirely. Its oil reserves dwarfed anything Germany could imagine. In 1944 alone, American oil production exceeded 1 billion barrels, feeding not only U.S. forces, but also Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The U.S. Army ran fleets of trucks, tanks, jeeps, and aircraft with a level of fuel consumption so high that German officers often dismissed early reports as exaggerations. But with each passing month, the truth became undeniable. And for officers like Colonel Ernst Keller, that truth was not an abstract statistic. It was a daily struggle. His regiment, like many on the Western Front, was tasked with slowing the relentless Allied advance after the breakout from Normandy. But slowing an enemy required mobility, and Germany no longer had it. Vehicles were rationed to the point where commanders traveled on bicycles or horses. Fuel intended for tanks was diverted to ambulances or artillery tractors. Even retreat required careful planning, as withdrawing too quickly risked burning precious gasoline. Captured fuel became priceless. German units launched small raids specifically to seize enemy fuel dumps, tanker trucks, or convoys. A single American jerry can could mean the difference between reaching the next defensive line or abandoning a half-full artillery battery. Intelligence reports frequently included estimates of Allied fuel storage, but these numbers often felt surreal, almost fictional to men who had grown accustomed to scarcity. Yet the scarcity was not only material, it was psychological. Inside the officer corps, a quiet but growing understanding spread. The war was being lost not only on the battlefield, but in the factories, refineries, and supply lines. Soldiers could still fight bravely, commanders could plan skillfully, but no amount of courage could substitute for the fuel needed to move a division. By late 1944, this imbalance became unbearable. The Americans, despite operating far from their homeland, moved with astonishing speed, constructing supply depots across liberated France. They used truck fleets like the Red Ball Express, running day and night to push fuel, ammunition, and rations to the front faster than German forces could retreat. U.S. logistics became a weapon, and fuel its sharpest edge. This is the world Colonel Keller walked through. A landscape where the ability to move, fight, or survive depended on the contents of a fuel drum. Each kilometer of road was measured against dwindling reserves. Each attack was weighed against the cost in gasoline. Each decision echoed the same truth. Germany's war was shrinking both in territory and in capacity. And it is within this collapsing logistical framework that the Colonel's discovery gains its full meaning. For when a man who has lived through months of emptiness suddenly stands before tens of thousands of gallons of untouched American fuel, the contrast is so overwhelming it cannot be ignored. It is the moment when scarcity collides violently with abundance, a moment that sets the stage for the deeper context that surrounds the Colonel's realization. As 1944 drew toward its bitter end, the Western Front had become a vast demonstration of what modern warfare truly required. Not only men and weapons, but an industrial heartbeat powerful enough to sustain millions of moving parts. Nowhere was this more visible than in the contrast between German desperation and American abundance. Germany still fielded hardened divisions with experienced officers, but their efforts were suffocated by a simple equation. Without fuel, mechanized warfare collapses into static defense, and static defense against an enemy with boundless mobility was a slow form of defeat. After the Allied breakout from Normandy in August 1944, the U.S. Army advanced so quickly that its own supply lines struggled to keep up. But the challenge was not a lack of fuel, it was the logistics of delivering it fast enough. The solution became one of the most remarkable supply operations of the war, the Red Ball Express. Beginning in late August, thousands of trucks, GMC deuces and a halves, raced from Normandy beaches to forward depots, hauling gasoline, ammunition, rations, spare parts. The system moved roughly 12,000 tons of supplies per day, an amount that dwarfed Germany's entire Western supply capability.
Every German officer knew of the Red Ball Express, though most learned about it through rumor or intercepted reports. To them, the idea of an army consuming hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel a day seemed fantastical, until reality proved otherwise. American armored divisions rolled forward with a consistency that stunned German defenders. Their tank battalions did not creep or ration movement. They maneuvered freely, often aggressively. Infantry divisions were motorized to a degree Germany could no longer match. Even artillery units used motorized prime movers that hauled guns across terrain impossible for German troops to mirror without fuel.
Meanwhile, the German supply situation deteriorated further each month. Allied bombing shredded rail networks, bridges vanished overnight. Trains became unreliable, then infrequent, then non-existent. Trucks were increasingly immobilized, not because they were destroyed, but because they were dry. Fuel trains, when they did move, were priority targets for Allied fighter bombers. Any movement in daylight risked destruction. Supplies that once took hours to deliver now required days, sometimes weeks. Within this tightening noose, field officers, like Colonel Ernst Keller, were forced into improvisation. Keller commanded a regiment assigned to hold a sector along the Meuse approaches, an area that had seen constant movement since the Allies' dramatic advance. His orders emphasized delaying actions, counterattacks when possible, and, above all, preserving mobility for when retreat became necessary. But mobility had become a theoretical luxury. His staff spent more time calculating how to stretch the last liters of gasoline than planning operations. By October, Keller received fuel rations that would barely keep a single armored company moving. To keep the rest of his vehicles operational, his men siphoned fuel from abandoned Wehrmacht trucks and even captured civilian tanks. Horses, once considered archaic in modern war, reappeared in frontline logistics. The contrast between this regression and the highly mechanized American push was impossible to ignore. On the other side, American engineers built supply depots at astonishing speed. In open fields, forest clearings, and near key road junctions, they erected rows of fuel drums, makeshift pump stations, and tanker refueling points. These depots were temporary but efficient, designed to be abandoned and re-established as the front moved. When one was no longer needed, the Americans simply left it behind, secure in the knowledge that their logistical chain stretched all the way back to secure ports and an economy that never seemed to slow down. To German eyes, these abandoned depots represented almost unimaginable wealth. A single U.S. fuel dump might contain more gasoline than an entire German corps received in a month. The notion that the Americans could afford to leave fuel behind, deliberately, reflected an imbalance more powerful than any tank division. It revealed the industrial war that Germany was never prepared to fight. Keller's unit had intercepted reports of such abandoned depots before, usually as they swept through areas temporarily vacated by fast-moving U.S. spearheads. But most of these caches were already destroyed, burned by retreating American troops to prevent German capture. The practice was standard. If a depot could not be evacuated, it was set ablaze. Yet sometimes, amid the chaos of rapid advance, something was overlooked. Fuel. Untouched. Intact. For a German officer in late 1944, this was equivalent to stumbling upon a treasure hoard. And Keller knew it. But he also knew the truth that accompanied such a discovery. If the Americans could leave behind this much fuel without hesitation, it meant the reserves behind them were even greater. And it was this widening gulf, the ever-growing distance between German scarcity and American saturation, that formed the backdrop to the moment when Keller stepped into that dark, silent shed. The shed that held not merely supplies, but a realization waiting to break through the last defenses of belief inside a career officer of the Wehrmacht. A realization that would soon unfold through multiple human, strategic, and technological angles. For Colonel Ernst Keller, the discovery did not register first as strategy nor as logistics. It struck him as a human blow. Months of exhaustion had carved deep lines beneath his eyes, and the men around him wore the same hollow expression carried by soldiers who had marched too far on too little. Keller had watched capable officers break under the pressure of retreat. He had written letters to families explaining why a son would not return. He had buried men who once believed they would be rolling into victory, not limping away from roads littered with burned-out vehicles. Fuel shortages had reshaped his regiment's daily life. Soldiers pushed trucks by hand to conserve gasoline. Mechanics drained the last usable drops from wrecked panzers. Young infantrymen grew accustomed to hearing the same refrain from their commanders: "We cannot move yet. We have no fuel." Keller had long accepted hardship as part of war, but scarcity, perpetual, grinding scarcity, broke something deeper. Scarcity meant uncertainty. Scarcity meant failure, not from lack of courage, but from a lack of means. Each morning began with calculations: how many vehicles could run, how far they could travel, how much ammunition they could haul. His regiment was no longer guided by plans, but by limitations. So, when Keller stepped into the shed and saw the gleaming rows of American fuel drums, the sight carried a human sting. His first thought was not victory, nor opportunity, nor tactical advantage. It was disbelief. The quiet weight of knowing that what his men desperately needed, what he had begged higher command for, what his entire army was starving for, lay here, untouched, as casually as hay bales left in a barn. It was a reminder that the enemy lived in another world entirely, one where movement was normal, where engines started at will, where soldiers did not push tanks, they rode in them. And for Keller, that contrast settled on his shoulders heavier than any battlefield defeat, because in that moment he understood the truth few dared to voice. This was a war Germany could no longer hope to sustain. Modern mechanized warfare was built on a simple principle: mobility is victory. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks, artillery, tractors, and aircraft all required the same lifeblood: fuel. In 1940, when Germany surged across Europe, it did so with engines roaring, consuming millions of liters of gasoline to maintain momentum. The Blitzkrieg was not magic, it was logistics on wheels. But by 1944, the Wehrmacht was fighting a different kind of war. The panzers that once spearheaded offensives now hid in forests, rationing fuel for only the most necessary counterattacks. Reconnaissance units, once the eyes and ears of the army, were reduced to bicycle or foot patrols. Even artillery suffered. Guns that could not be pulled by vehicles became static, losing their strategic value. Meanwhile, the American military had become a model of logistical supremacy. Their campaigns were not driven solely by battlefield tactics, but by an immense industrial network that kept every unit supplied with remarkable consistency. Fuel depots sprawled across liberated territories. Tanker trucks refilled armored divisions on the move. Airfields consumed thousands of gallons daily without hesitation. An American armored division could burn 100,000 gallons of fuel in a single day of heavy operations, and if it needed more, more arrived, delivered by a supply apparatus that worked like a machine with endless gears. To Keller, the fuel dump represented more than just a tactical advantage. It was a symbol of American industrial reach. 50,000 gallons could keep a German corps active for days, maybe even turn the tide of a localized battle. But to the Americans, it was simply one deposit among countless others, something they could afford to abandon. And that was the true realization. Germany was not losing because its soldiers fought poorly or its officers lacked skill. It was losing because the industrial power behind its armies had collapsed, while the enemies continued to surge forward, vast and unbroken. From the American viewpoint, fuel was not merely a resource, it was a guarantee. It enabled the aggressive operational tempo that characterized their advance from Normandy to the German frontier. American commanders expected their units to move fast, press advantages, and maintain pressure. They could only demand this because they were confident fuel would be there. To American logistics officers, a 50,000-gallon depot was routine. It was one node in a supply network stretching back across France, England, and the Atlantic Ocean. If tactical necessity required abandoning such a depot during rapid movement, so be it. New depots could be built. deliveries could be increased. Tankers, trucks, and pipelines ensured the front never ran dry. This abundance had a psychological effect as powerful as its practical one. American tank crews fought knowing that their vehicles would be refueled tonight and again tomorrow. Infantry units marched with trucks following behind, not far ahead. Even when shortages occurred, they were temporary, never existential. The Germans, observing this, realized they were facing not just an enemy army.
A commander's role is to preserve the fighting strength of his unit, to act with reason, and to safeguard the lives of his soldiers where possible. But how could he fulfill that duty when the broader war effort was collapsing behind him? How could he tell his men to fight on when he had just seen, with his own eyes, evidence that their struggle had long ceased to be viable? The moral angle sharpened the pain of the discovery. It transformed the fuel drums from mere objects into symbols of a war whose moral justification had dissolved. Keller's duty remained, but the meaning behind that duty had begun to fracture. And as these human, technological, enemy, strategic, psychological, and moral angles converged, they formed the foundation for the moment when the war's turning point would become undeniable. A turning point that would erupt in full force during the event that followed. The fog had begun to lift when Colonel Ernst Keller ordered his men to clear a path through the collapsed beams inside the abandoned farm shed. Sunlight crept through the broken roof, revealing more detail with each passing minute. What he had first taken as a modest cache now stretched into the shadows. Barrels stacked 3 high, rows extending deeper than the eye could comfortably judge. The faint smell of gasoline thickened the air with every step he took. It clung to the walls, seeped into the cold morning light, and settled like a heavy presence on the men who followed him. A lieutenant knelt beside one of the drums. He tapped it with his knuckles. Full. Another soldier checked the markings. U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Clear, unmistakable. A third man climbed the rusted ladder of the abandoned tanker truck, sweeping dust from the gauges. "Colonel," he called down quietly, "the tank, it's full." Keller approached slowly. He pressed a gloved hand against the cold metal of the tanker. 50,000 gallons. Perhaps more. Enough fuel to power a full mechanized regiment. Enough to sustain armored thrusts, supply medical evacuations, run communication vehicles, and keep artillery on the move. Enough, in a world defined by scarcity, to feel unreal. But the shock did not come from the quantity alone. It came from the context. This depot had not been hidden. It had not been guarded. It had not even been destroyed. The Americans had simply outrun it. Their advance had been so rapid and their logistical reserves so immense that they had abandoned a fuel supply large enough to change the fate of Keller's entire sector. The colonel walked slowly along the rows of barrels, boots echoing through the silent shed. Each step deepened the contrast between what he saw and what he knew of his own army. His mind drifted back to the desperate weeks that preceded this moment. Reports of tanks sitting idle for lack of fuel, artillery units unable to reposition, reconnaissance patrols canceled because trucks could not be spared the gasoline. He recalled writing to divisional command pleading for additional allotments, only to receive the same answer: not available. His men had marched on foot beside vehicles that should have carried them. They had pushed trucks by hand to save the last precious liters in their tanks. And here, in this forgotten corner of the retreat, stood an American fuel supply so vast that it had not warranted the effort required to relocate or destroy it. Keller's breath caught slightly as the reality settled deeper. This was not just fuel. This was a message. Germany's war machine was no longer functioning on the same scale as its enemy. The Americans operated with an industrial momentum that rendered such depots disposable. They fought with confidence and an endless logistical tide behind them, one that Germany could not hope to match. If 50,000 gallons could be left behind as an afterthought, then what magnitude of reserves still fed the U.S. advance? The colonel turned toward his adjutant. He said, "Secure the area." His voice held none of the triumph that should have accompanied such a discovery. The men saluted and hurried to carry out his orders, but Keller remained still, staring at the fuel drums as if they were monuments to a truth he had long tried to ignore. He reached into his coat pocket, retrieving a worn map of the sector. He studied the lines showing the American penetration, the German fallback positions, the narrowing options. The terrain still mattered, the weather still mattered, but fuel mattered more than all of it. With fuel, an army could decide its fate. Without it, the enemy decided for you. He traced the front line with his gloved finger, imagining how rapidly the Americans could move with resources like this behind them. How easily they could reinforce one sector, exploit a weakness, or envelop a position. Their speed, their precision, their relentless advance. All of it, he realized, stemmed from the power represented within these steel drums. He closed the map slowly. In wars past, Keller had believed that discipline, courage, and tactical brilliance shaped destiny. Now he understood that in modern war, those qualities were secondary. Engines won battles. Fuel won campaigns. Industry won wars. And here, in the quiet of an abandoned depot, that truth became undeniable. He felt no anger, only a deep, heavy certainty. A certainty colder than the air drifting through the broken roof beams. Germany could not compete with this. Not anymore. This moment was the turning point not because the fuel changed the tactical situation, but because it stripped away the last illusions. The colonel had seen shortages, retreats, and depleted divisions, but this was the first time he had encountered overwhelming evidence that the imbalance was absolute. A lieutenant approached, saluted, and handed him a clipboard. "What are your orders, Herr Oberst?" asked the young officer. Keller looked at the barrels once more before responding. He said, "Prepare a report for divisional command. They must see what we have found." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. No report, no matter how detailed, could change the fate that was unfolding. Germany was not losing because it was outmaneuvered. It was losing because it was outproduced. And the full force of that reality would become undeniable when the consequences of this discovery echoed up the chain of command. Keller's report moved quickly through divisional channels, carried by a courier who drove through the night using fuel freshly siphoned from the American depot. Dawn found the message on the desk of General Lieutenant Albrecht Reinhardt, commander of the sector. He read it twice, slowly, running a tired hand across his forehead. The numbers were clear. 50,000 gallons, perhaps more. Enough to supply not only Keller's regiment, but multiple battle groups. Enough to form the backbone of a mobile counteraction. But the general did not smile. He did not celebrate. He exhaled long and deeply, as if the paper itself weighed more than he could bear. He said, "This changes nothing." It was not resignation, it was realism. The last months had taught the High Command a grim lesson. One depot, no matter how large, could not reverse the tide of a continental war. Germany needed millions of gallons weekly. It was receiving thousands, sometimes only hundreds. The imbalance was too great. Still, orders were sent. Secure the fuel. Transfer what you can. Prepare vehicles. Attempt limited local maneuvers. These were instructions written more from obligation than optimism. By midday, Keller's men had organized the depot with military precision. Barrels lined the yard. Hoses snaked across the ground. Tanker trucks groaned as they filled, one by one. Mechanics hurried between vehicles, checking engines dormant for days. The colonel stood among the activity, watching the sudden burst of energy that swept his unit. The men felt revived. They joked, they smiled, they spoke of possibilities. But Keller remained silent, hands clasped behind his back. He walked to the edge of the property where the road curved toward the front. In the distance, faint columns of smoke rose, wrecked German transports caught by Allied fighter-bombers. The skies above were dominated by Allied aircraft, a constant reminder that mobility alone no longer guaranteed safety.
The first trucks rolled out, heading toward forward positions. Their engines rumbled confidently, a sound that had become rare in recent months. Keller followed the convoy on foot for a short distance, listening to the mechanical rhythm that once defined German warfare. But even this movement highlighted the truth. The fuel could be used, but not protected. By late afternoon, American reconnaissance planes circled overhead. They spotted unusual activity: trucks, movement, smoke from hastily restarted engines. Within hours, reports reached U.S. field commanders. The enemy had stumbled upon a depot they had left behind. An order was issued: dispatch fighter bombers, disrupt any German attempt to exploit the depot. Twilight brought the first wave. The roar of engines pierced the quiet, followed by the shriek of diving aircraft. Keller shouted for his men to take cover as the ground erupted in blasts. Fuel drums ignited in towering flames. Trucks overturned. Black smoke spiraled toward the evening sky. The depot that had offered hope now burned with violent fury, illuminating the farmyard in a hellish glow. Keller crawled behind a collapsed wall as fireballs rippled through the yard. The heat washed against his face. Secondary explosions detonated along the rows of barrels. Men scrambled, dragging the wounded, shielding their faces from flying debris. Within minutes, half the depot was gone. The Americans had not even needed to send ground forces. Air power, fueled by limitless supply, was enough to erase the find. When the last aircraft circled away, silence returned, broken only by crackling flames and the groans of injured soldiers. Keller stood slowly, dusted ash from his uniform, and surveyed the destruction. The truth pressed down on him with brutal clarity. Even when Germany found fuel, it could not hold it. Even when it captured resources, it could not protect them. Even when it gained an advantage, it could not convert it. He walked through the wreckage, stepping over shattered drum fragments and burned-out trucks. A medic passed with a stretcher. Keller paused, placing a hand gently on the shoulder of the wounded man being carried. One of his drivers, burned but conscious, his eyes filled with confusion. "We almost made use of it, Herr Oberst," the soldier whispered. Keller nodded, though the words cut deeply. Almost. Nearly. Just short. Words that had defined Germany's war for months. As night settled fully over the smoldering remains of the depot, Keller returned to his command post. He sat at a small wooden table, lit by a dim oil lamp, and began drafting a follow-up report. His pen moved slowly at first, then with grim steadiness. Enemy air superiority prevents sustained exploitation of captured fuel resources. Mobility improvements, temporary. Operational advantage, neutralized within hours. Enemy logistics remain overwhelmingly superior. He paused before writing the final line, one that was not required but felt necessary. The state of our fuel, transport, and air defense capabilities suggest we can no longer conduct effective operations. It was the closest Keller had ever come to stating openly what he now believed fully. The war was over in all but name. The discovery of 50,000 gallons had not brought hope. It had revealed the scale of the gap, and that gap was fatal. The consequences of this realization would spread far beyond one burned depot into the way German command viewed the final phase of the war. The smoldering ruins of the fuel depot marked more than a tactical setback. It marked a psychological fracture inside the German command structure. Word of the discovery and its rapid destruction spread through battalion and regimental reports over the next 48 hours. In every retelling, the same bitter theme emerged. Even when fortune favored them, the Reich no longer had the capacity to turn opportunity into strength. Colonel Keller's written assessment reached Corps headquarters by the week's end. The phrasing was restrained, professional, and factual, yet the implications were unmistakable. German Logistics Command, already drowning in shortages, used the report as another grim data point in a pattern that had become impossible to ignore. For months, depots had been empty. Fuel trains had been ambushed. Synthetic plants had been bombed into silence. Motorized divisions, the pride of early German warfare, now fought like foot infantry, their armored vehicles parked behind hedgerows as immobile steel monuments to early war ambition. The contrast with the Americans, highlighted by the sheer scale of their abandoned supplies, had never been starker. Senior officers who read Keller's report did not debate its accuracy. They debated how to break the news to superiors who still demanded counteroffensives that required thousands of gallons Germany no longer possessed. One general scribbled a note in the margin: "Resources insufficient for any sustained action. Recommend defensive posture." Another wrote simply, "We cannot match this." For front-line units, the aftermath took on a different weight. Soldiers who had briefly tasted mobility, those who had driven the refueled trucks, those who had heard engines roar again, now faced the crushing return to scarcity. The burned depot remained visible for days, a charred silhouette on the horizon. Its blackened fumes drifted across nearby positions, the smell of wasted fuel clinging to uniforms and equipment like a quiet accusation. Keller toured the forward trenches 3 days after the attack. Men asked him cautiously whether more fuel had been saved, whether new orders had arrived, whether the discovery had changed anything. He answered honestly. Small amounts had been salvaged, but not enough to shift the front. His candor, though difficult to hear, earned respect. German soldiers had grown weary of hollow optimism. They preferred the truth, even when it darkened the road ahead. Strategically, German planners tried to assess what the discovery revealed about American operations. Intelligence officers concluded that the depot had likely been left behind intentionally during a rapid advance, one accelerated by near unlimited motor fuel. The Americans could afford to move fast. They could afford to abandon supplies. They could afford losses. Germany could afford none of these things. Reports from across the Western Front reinforced the pattern. American armored divisions maintained mobility, even in harsh weather. Their supply trains ran at full strength. Their logistics chains stretched confidently from Normandy to Belgium, and above them, Allied aircraft patrolled skies with fuel-heavy tanks slung under their wings. In contrast, German defenses hardened into immobility. The front stabilized not because commanders wanted it to, but because they lacked the resources to shift it. The discovery of the depot served as a brutal reminder that the Wehrmacht was no longer an army of movement. It was an army waiting, often helplessly, for the next American push. Even German civilians indirectly felt the aftermath. Rumors circulated about fuel shortages at the front. Some whispered that officers were walking between positions because vehicles could no longer be risked. These rumors were not propaganda, they were truth carried back by wounded soldiers and retreating units. Within Keller's own command, the psychological climate changed subtly but decisively. Officers met at smaller tables, speaking in lower voices. Maps were studied not for potential advances, but for routes of retreat. Engineers fortified bridges that they knew they might soon need to destroy. Everything became defensive. Everything became temporary. And through it all, Keller's report, calm, detailed, unembellished, remained a quiet turning point. It had not caused the collapse, it had clarified it. The consequences of this recognition would only grow sharper in the weeks to come. The destruction of the American fuel cache did not fade from military memory. Instead, it evolved into a reference point, an example repeatedly cited during strategic briefings. Senior commanders used it to illustrate a sobering reality. Even when the Wehrmacht stumbled upon resources capable of powering a small offensive, the enemy's dominance in the air and on the ground ensured those gains were fleeting. Within Keller's sector, the scarcity of fuel became more than an operational limitation. It became a defining trait of everyday life. Infantry patrols grew shorter. Resupply runs that once took hours now stretched into full-day journeys as drivers navigated indirect roads to conserve every drop. Tanks that had burned precious gallons moving the captured fuel were ordered into static defensive positions, essentially becoming fixed artillery pieces. The shift marked a symbolic end to Germany's early war doctrine, a military once admired for its mobility now settling into immobile desperation. By December 1944, the broader implications were impossible to ignore. Reports from across the Western Front described similar conditions. Panzer brigades rationed fuel to such a degree that training exercises were cancelled entirely. Young replacement crews entered battle with minimal driving practice. Entire battalions marched instead of riding, even when trucks stood idle. The discovery of the depot had revealed how deeply shortages cut into readiness. Meanwhile, American logistical superiority grew more visible with each passing week. Columns of U.S. trucks streamed across France, carrying fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, protected by constant air cover. The Allies could afford redundancy. If one depot was destroyed or abandoned, 3 more stood ready behind it. The enemy was mathematical and merciless. German high command attempted to find strategic meaning in Keller's account. Intelligence analysts studied maps of American supply routes, trying to determine whether more such depots might be hidden or abandoned during the rapid Allied advance. But optimism never lasted long. Even if more caches existed, any attempt to capture and exploit them would draw the same overwhelming air response. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel starvation and pilot losses, no longer could shield ground operations. This made every